Good morning, everyone. Today, we are diving into something fascinating, the anatomy of a draw, what we can call a strategic evolution. While the board you see here is for the classic game of Othello, our focus isn't on winning or losing, it's about understanding process. Specifically, we are decoding how a complex system progresses from its initial state of chaos, the opening scramble, all the way to a perfect, stable equilibrium. Think of this concept as a powerful analogy for any high-stakes business environment. When a project starts, or when a market first emerges, it is often messy and unpredictable. There are countless variables flying around. Our goal, then, is to track that journey. How does the system naturally refine itself? How does initial uncertainty resolve into predictable stability? By analyzing this progression in Othello, we can extract universal principles of strategic optimization, principles that apply directly to refining our operations and achieving sustainable, long-term balance within our own organization. Let's begin by looking at what drives these early moves. The life cycle of any complex system, whether it's a chess match or a major business initiative, can be broken down into three distinct, yet interconnected, phases. We begin with Phase 1, the opening. Here, the board is sparse and strategic tension is low. Our focus isn't on immediate conflict, rather, it's about establishing foundational influence and central control. We are laying the groundwork for future success. As we move into Phase 2, mid-game tension, everything changes dramatically. The density increases rapidly, which means the complexity rises, and the stakes are at their peak. This is the intense battleground, a period of constant skirmishes where tempo, positional advantage, and sheer tactical dominance are fought for every single move. Finally, we reach Phase 3, endgame precision. Here, the system reaches its highest density, but the focus shifts entirely from broad conflict to surgical precision. The objectives become extremely specific, identifying forcing sequences, locking down structure, and making decisive moves that guarantee a win. Understanding this progression, from foundational planning to intense combat, and finally to precise execution, is key to mastering any complex endeavor. When analyzing Phase 1 of this strategy, the overarching takeaway is that early moves are less about making immediate flips and much more about controlling tempo and limiting your opponent's paths for expansion. The key to success begins right in the core, what we call the central cluster. Our initial focus must be on securing those central intersections because they provide maximum leverage point for outward extension. This gives us flexibility across the entire board. However, simply holding the center isn't enough, we also have to consider the corners. Establishing an early foothold here is absolutely paramount. Why? Because control of the center dictates who ultimately gets access to those foundational corner pillars. It's a power dynamic. Whoever controls the nexus has influence over the edges and the corners. Ultimately, this phase isn't about brute force. It's a strategic game of chess where we are using limited moves not just to advance our own position, but critically, to restrict the available options for our opponent. When we analyze this board, it's clear that strategy isn't random, it's about controlling specific geographic zones. We can break down these priorities into three critical areas. First, there is the center. This is the engine room of any operation. It controls tempo and allows for multi-directional attacks across your entire business model. It represents high volatility, massive opportunity, but also significant risk if it becomes contested. Next, we have the edges. Think of these as defensive perimeters or walls around your core assets. Their primary function is containment. They restrict opponent expansion and act as a reliable positional shield that stabilizes your position over time. Finally, and perhaps most critically, are the corners. These spots represent the ultimate objective. They are unflippable points, meaning once you secure them, they provide long-term structural advantage and dictate the final piece count of your strategic assets. Mastering these corners is what determines victory in the endgame. In short, success requires a balance, using the center for aggressive momentum, relying on the edges for stability, and securing the corners to guarantee lasting, foundational strength. As we move deeper into the game or project this strategy onto a real-world business scenario, the focus shifts dramatically. We are no longer in a phase of pure expansion. Instead, we enter the realm of tactical skirmishes where every single empty square becomes an intensely contested junction point. The key takeaway here is that control is everything. This brings us to the concept of tempo. Tempo isn't just about making a move, it's about dictating when and how the opponent moves. When you possess tempo, you force your competitor into a reactive posture, constantly defending rather than initiating their own strategy. And how do we maintain that initiative? By establishing threat clusters. This is where strategic planning meets execution. We aren't just threatening one area, we are securing adjacent squares to create forks, meaning we are simultaneously threatening 2 or even 3 separate groups of the opponent's assets. The goal is always to overwhelm them by making them unable to address all threats at once. Ultimately, mastering this phase means moving beyond simple force and focusing entirely on strategic timing and multi-layered control. The key takeaway here is that simply having a massive amount of resources or material advantage can actually be a liability. It's what we call the trap of the mid-game point lead. As this visual demonstrates, while accumulating many pieces gives you quantity, it often sacrifices structure. Having too much raw material doesn't guarantee success. In fact, it can limit your available moves and increase the overall surface area that your opponent can exploit. Therefore, the superior strategy is not to chase immediate gains or focus on sheer numbers. Instead, elite play focuses on positional strength. We need to prioritize building a solid, unassailable defensive structure, a strong foundation, on one side of our market. This allows us to manage risk and maintain control, even if we temporarily concede ground in the center. Ultimately, strategic positioning, or structural advantage, is far more valuable than mere accumulation. It's about controlling the board rather than just owning pieces on it. When we talk about mastering a complex system, like this one, the key is often knowing how to transition from slow build-up to decisive action. This is what we call the forcing sequence, a powerful mechanism designed to break mid-game tension and take control of the rhythm. It's not just about making moves, it's about dictating when and how those moves happen. The sequence unfolds in 3 critical steps. First, we initiate with placement. We establish a strong initial position, creating an imbalance that demands attention. Next comes the reaction. This is where the system forces the opponent to respond defensively. They have no choice but to address our pressure point. Finally, and most critically, we execute the exploitation. By capitalizing on the defensive moves made in Step 2, we claim territory and seize command of the game space entirely. Essentially, this sequence allows us to move from passive accumulation to active disruption, ensuring that every move we make dictates the next action. This final phase is arguably the most critical. We move from simply expanding our territory to achieving structural lockdown and establishing irreversible capture chains across the board. The fundamental shift here is that the game changes entirely. It's no longer about growth, it's about connection and securing every last seam. Because the board is so dense at this point, any mistake becomes immediately fatal. Our objective is highly precise. We must secure those final empty pockets and systematically lock down entire quadrants to prevent opponents from finding even a single avenue of attack. The execution relies on deep, calculated moves. We aren't just making random flips, we are calculating massive, multi-directional capture chains. This requires players to rely heavily on the anchor points, the corners and edges, that were strategically established during the earlier mid-game. By leveraging those foundational placements, we can execute devastating flips that create a cascade effect, effectively locking down any remaining options our opponent might have had. What we are looking at here is not simply a draw, it is, in fact, a masterclass in achieving perfect strategic equilibrium. The ultimate result of this intense match was a 32-32 draw, a state that represents absolute balance on the board. Now, how does such an equilibrium happen? Crucially, neither side relies on brute force or overwhelming aggression. Instead, both players exhibit exquisite positional play. This means they are constantly neutralizing their opponent's threats while simultaneously advancing their own territory in small, calculated increments. They are playing a game of sustained balance. Looking at the board, you can see that every single move was designed not to win immediately, but to maintain parity and deny any overwhelming dominance. The implication here is profound. True brilliance isn't always about the knockout blow, it's often about defensive mastery, the ability to calculate every move necessary to sustain a stable, balanced position over the long term. This concept of managed equilibrium is what we should all strive for in our own strategic planning. When we talk about decoding the Othello progression, what we are really doing is mapping out a strategic lifecycle, a path from basic tactics to sophisticated, sustained competitive advantage. This isn't just about having resources, it's about how you deploy them. First, we must prioritize structure over count. The key takeaway here is that sheer volume of assets or manpower means nothing if your foundation is weak. Instead of simply accumulating pieces, we need to focus on building defensible walls and anchoring points, the critical nodes in our business model. Next, we move to mastering the tempo. This is about control. We cannot afford to be reactive. Our goal must always be to create forcing sequences that dictate the pace of the game. We don't wait for the market to change, we force the market to react to our timeline and our terms. Finally, at the highest level, we prepare for parity. This is the endgame, the long grind. High-level play isn't about a single breakthrough, it's about attrition. It means maintaining structural advantages over time, calculating every move precisely, and ensuring that even when the competition matches our strength, our underlying structure remains superior until the very end.